The final arrow left the string with a sharp, sickening thwack. It was a sound swallowed instantly by the chaos of men screaming and the desperate clatter of steel against stone. Yet for one man, standing exposed on the ramparts of Pyongyang fortress, the sound was deafeningly singular. This was the year 371 CE. The freezing wind, usually a loyal ally of the northern kingdom, carried the stink of burning pitch and fresh blood straight into the face of King Gogukwon of Goguryeo. His armor, once burnished gold, was scored black and red. Below him, the siege towers of the enemy had finally broken the outer walls. The attackers surged forward, not in a disorganized mob, but in disciplined, relentless waves. Gogukwon raised his sword, its handle slick with sweat and gore. He was a king, a Tiwang Tawang, of the most martial people in East Asia, yet he was cornered, fighting for his life, fighting for the legacy of 2 centuries of blood and iron. And his attackers were not the familiar northern bandits nor the powerful armies of China. They were his kin, his fierce rivals from the south, the shock troops of Baekje. The king turned, seeking the face of the commander who had led this impossible siege, the face of King Gunchogo of Baekje, but the enemy leader was protected far behind the advancing spear phalanxes. Suddenly, a massive shield was thrust aside by a Baekje officer, a blur of crimson and black lacquer armor. The officer, fueled by the sheer audacity of being the first to breach the royal stronghold, roared a challenge that was pure, visceral hate. King Gogukwon met the charge, his aged body responding with the instinct of decades of warfare. Steel struck steel, showering sparks into the smoke-filled air. But the king was already wounded, already exhausted, the weight of his collapsing kingdom dragging on his weapon arm. He staggered backward. In that microsecond, time seemed to dilate. He saw the faces of his ancestors carved onto the stones of Gune fortress. He saw the distant, freezing plains where the nation was born. He tasted the sour dust of inevitable defeat. And then the second arrow hit. Not a battle tip meant to kill, but a specialized bolt, blunt and heavy, designed for maximal impact against a weak point. It caught the king directly below the neck guard, crushing cartilage and bone. The shock was blinding, instantaneous, stealing his breath and his vision. He fell not with a cry, but a muffled, guttural gasp, collapsing onto the frozen earth he had sworn to protect. The roar of the victorious Baekje army was the sound of history breaking. A king of Goguryeo, the mighty northern empire, had fallen, killed on his own ramparts by the hands of his rival. This was not merely a skirmish. It was the definitive, violent declaration that the long, fragmented age following the collapse of Go-Josun was over. The game had changed. The three kingdoms, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, were no longer fragile proto-states, but consolidated, warring empires fully prepared to bathe the peninsula in blood for supremacy. To understand how two sister states, Goguryeo, the colossal wolf of the north, and Baekje, the refined tiger of the south, reached this point of fratricidal culmination, we must rewind the clock almost 5 centuries. We must return to the moment when the ancient order died, leaving a geopolitical wound that would take centuries of violence and institutional revolution to heal. The world into which the three kingdoms were born was a world defined by a great, yawning vacuum. For centuries, the political anchor of the region had been Go-Josun, the ancient kingdom that stretched across the northern Korean peninsula and parts of Manchuria. But Go-Josun was a colossal entity built upon brittle foundations, undermined by internal discord and the relentless, suffocating expansionism of the Han dynasty of China. In 108 BCE, the sword of Emperor Wu of Han finally cut the cord. Go-Josun fell. But empires, even when destroyed, leave terrible footprints. The Han dynasty, wishing to maintain control over the newly conquered territories and exploit the vast resources and trade routes, did not leave. Instead, they imposed administrative outposts known as the Four Commandaries or Hansagun Hansagun. The most powerful and enduring of these was the Leilong Commandery. Imagine a colonial city planted deep within foreign soil, a technological beacon and a political cancer simultaneously. Leilong was a conduit, channeling the advanced material culture of Han China, its sophisticated writing system, its bureaucratic models, its philosophies, and most critically, its iron culture. Before the commandery, life in the peninsula was rooted in the Bronze Age, beautiful, ceremonial, but limited in its military and agricultural potential. Suddenly, iron, stronger, cheaper, and more abundant, was accessible. Iron axes allowed for rapid deforestation and land reclamation. Iron plowshares drastically increased agricultural yields, creating the surplus necessary to feed large, non-producing military and aristocratic classes. This was the geopolitical reality. Fragmented indigenous tribes, known collectively as the Yimik, Yemek in the north and the Han Han in the south, found themselves pressed between the technological might of Leleng and the imperative to organize themselves to survive. In the south, where fertile river plains encouraged agrarian life, the indigenous groups coalesced into the Samhan Samhan confederacies, Mehan Mahan, Jinhan Jinhan, and Byeonhan Bayanhan. These were not kingdoms but fluid, decentralized leagues of small city-states, or Uprak Gukka Uprak Guga, each ruled by local chiefs Shinji Shinji. Mahan, with its 54 constituent states, was the largest, led nominally by the powerful Mokji Guk Mokji Gug. But the true engine of change lay in the resource-rich southeast, Byeonhan. This region, which would later become the Gaya Confederacy, was the undisputed master of iron smelting. Their furnaces glowed day and night, producing superior iron ingots, tonggiso, so valuable they functioned as currency, traded across the Yellow Sea to Leleng and across the narrow straits to the distant Japanese archipelago known then as Wa. Their economic power was immense, yet their political structure remained fatally fragmented. Meanwhile, the north was a crucible of hardening military prowess. Northeast of the fallen Go-Josun, in the rugged terrain of Manchuria, existed the state of Buya. Baekje was an advanced, highly organized kingdom, a beacon of northern statecraft, whose political stability was reflected in its unique system where the king's power was tempered by a council of 5 powerful tribal chiefs, the Yiga. But Baekje itself faced constant pressure from the harsh, migrating nomadic groups of the Manchurian plain, the Xingnu, the Xianbei. Its strength was a magnet for ambition, and its very existence represented a political model that demanded emulation or outright conquest. The world was waiting for a decisive shift, a leader or a group strong enough to integrate the advanced iron culture, the sophisticated Chinese administrative models, and the martial tradition of the North with the indigenous political structures of the South. This necessity for centralization, moving from a decentralized Yunmang Wangguk confederate kingdom, where the king was merely primus inter pares, first among equals, to a Godiguk Godeguk, centralized ancient state with a powerful hereditary monarch, would define the next 3 centuries. The tribes realized that loose alliances could not withstand the organized warfare and resource mobilization required to challenge Han authority or subdue their neighbors. Only a divine mandate backed by codified law Yelyong, a standardized bureaucracy Guandong, and an absolute single leader could forge a viable nation in this hostile landscape. The stage was set for the entrance of 3 distinct political narratives, each claiming legitimacy from either celestial mandate, northern lineage, or indigenous root. The fragmentation had ended. The fight for unification was about to begin. The birth of the 3 kingdoms was not a clean transition, but a complex process of political migration, mythological appropriation, and relentless military imposition. 2 states, Goguryeo and Baekje, arrived on the scene with the bold, aggressive confidence of the North, claiming a shared ancestral legitimacy that immediately positioned them above their southern rivals. The first to rise was Goguryeo. The Genesis story of Goguryeo, preserved in texts like the Samguk Sagi, Samguk Saji, begins not in its final homeland but in the court of Baekje. The hero of this narrative is Jumong, or King Dongmyeonseong Dongmyeong Sungwang. Jumong's story is a political document dressed in the glittering robes of myth. He was the son of the sun god's descendant, Masu, and the river god's daughter, Yuhua, a dual celestial heritage cementing his divine mandate, Shenseonghin Hyiltong. Raised in Baekje, Jumong was a magnificent archer, his skill with the bow proving his superiority over the sons of King Jumwa of Baekje. But this very superiority made him a target. Jumong's inner thoughts must have been a cauldron of fear and ambition. I cannot stay here. If I submit, I am just a powerful soldier in Baekje's history. If I flee, I can be a king in my own right, but I must take only the loyal and I must not look back. He fled south with 3 loyal companions, traversing freezing rivers and dense forest. The myth tells of his moment of crisis at the river. Being pursued by the jealous forces of Baekje, Jumong stood on the bank and cried out to the heavens for passage. Immediately, fish and turtles rose from the depths, forming a living bridge upon which he walked to freedom. This miraculous escape was necessary to establish the core ideological claim. Jumong was not merely an exiled prince, he was the chosen of heaven and earth. Jumong settled in the rugged, mountainous Jalban-Jolban region along the middle reaches of the Yalu-Amnikgang River, a place defined by high peaks and deep valleys where arable land was desperately scarce. This geography dictated the entire trajectory of the nascent state. It had to be martial, it had to expand. Survival was a continuous military operation. To solidify his base, Jumong executed a brilliant political maneuver. He married the daughter of the local Jalban chieftain, Lady Soseno, merging his superior Baekje military organization and lineage claim with the vital indigenous resources and political network. But the establishment of Goguryeo, c. 37 BCE, was only the beginning of centralization. The early state was a fragile coalition of 5 powerful tribal factions, the Obu 5 tribes. Jumong's Jairubu clan held the throne, but power was checked by the Jega Pyongwiho Yiga Pyongwiho, a powerful council of chiefs who collectively oversaw high matters of state. The king was a figurehead who reigned but did not rule absolutely, yet. Goguryeo immediately turned its gaze outward. Facing the encroaching military presence of the Han Commandery, Xuantu, Haiyantu, and the remaining strongholds of Leleng, the young kingdom honed its identity. A fierce, resilient warrior state, eternally resisting the giant to the west. Meanwhile, the same foundational material was being forged into a very different polity far to the south. Baekje c. 18 BCE was founded by Onjo, a figure intimately linked to Jumong's line, variously described as his son or grandson. Onjo and his brother Biryu were the children of Lady Soseno. When Jumong's original son, Yuri, arrived from Baekje to claim the Goguryeo throne, Onjo and Biryu recognized the political necessity of exile. They led a large migration of their mother's followers, skilled artisans, soldiers, and aristocrats, southward. This migration was the first great historical movement of elite northern culture into the south, seeking a new homeland. Biryu, seduced by the open sea and promises of easy maritime trade, chose the coastal region of Michuhol, near modern Incheon. Onjo, pragmatic and relying on the advice of elders like Ogun and Marieo, settled in the fertile, strategic Wiraisung area along the Han River basin. The geography proved decisive. Michuhol was salt marsh and swamp, unsuitable for large-scale agriculture. Biryu's people quickly faced hardship and famine. Onjo's settlement, nestled in the vast, rich floodplains of the Han River, thrived. The inner conflict of Biryu must have been devastating. The shame of the failed settlement, the environmental betrayal of the coast, forcing him to witness his younger brother's success. Biryu eventually confronted Onjo, leading to a clash that ended in Biryu's defeat and suicide. Onjo's victory was not just familial, it was the political and environmental triumph of strategic agrarianism over flawed maritime ambition. Biryu's followers quickly merged with Onjo's community, consolidating the new state. Onjo renamed the state Baekje, meaning 100 settlers, a name that both acknowledged the diverse groups now under his rule and, like Goguryeo, asserted his Baekje lineage as the nucleus of the new southern power. Baekje was a master of political absorption. They were founded within the territory of the Mahan Confederacy, and their long-term goal was the complete subjugation of the local Mahan states, particularly the powerful Mokji-guk. Baekje had the advantage of location, rich agricultural land, and immediate access to trade routes, leading to a path of sophisticated, centralized governance achieved far earlier than their southeastern counterpart. Far away in the deep southeast, the story of Silla unfolded without the dramatic migration or military might of its northern rivals. Silla's formation was slow, gradual, and rooted purely in indigenous consolidation. Its original nucleus was Saroguk, one of the 12 small states within the Jinhan-Truhan Confederacy. Silla's founding myth, set in 57 BCE, centered on Baekje Pak Hayakguse. Hyokjios did not descend from a migrating prince. He hatched from a colossal purple egg found next to a well guarded by a sacred white horse. Simultaneously, his future queen, Alyong, was born from the side of a dragon near a river. This Nansing Sialhua Nansang Salechua egg birth myth was vital. It linked the founder not to external political lineage like Baekje, but to the local indigenous deities of the land, establishing a deep, sacred mandate to rule the Gyeongju-Gyeongju basin. The founding structure reflected this local origin. The state was a coalition of 6 powerful local clans, the Yukchan Yukchon, who enthroned Hyokjias as their leader, calling him Jeoseogan Gasagan, a title suggesting a powerful tribal chief or ritual leader. For centuries, Silla's political structure would be a delicate dance between the reigning monarch and the consensus of the 6 clans, formalized in the Hwabik Council, a body of aristocrats with veto power, capable of dethroning kings if they failed to achieve unanimous consent. Silla was geographically isolated, buffered by the Baekje-controlled Mahan region and the Iron Kingdom of Gaya. This isolation meant that technological and cultural advancement lagged behind Goguryeo and Baekje, which had direct contact with the Han commandaries. Silla's early rulers, often alternating among the Bak, Siak, and Kim clans, reflected a state still operating as a tribal league, not a centralized monarchy. Titles evolved slowly, from Jeoseogan chief to Chachong priest king, suggesting strong shamanistic authority, to Izajiam elder, suggesting lineage succession. It would not be until the late 4th century, under King Nimal Namul, that the Kim clan would finally assert hereditary succession, adopting the title Maripgan Great Chief, a clear step toward kingship, but still lacking the imperial weight of the northern Tiwang. The 3 kingdoms were now born: Goguryeo, the martial descendant of Baekje established in the mountains; Baekje, the pragmatic master of the river plain founded on northern migration within a southern context; and Silla, the quiet, isolated indigenous power slowly consolidating its local roots. The stage was set not for peaceful coexistence, but for centuries of bloody institutional warfare. The 3rd and 4th centuries CE witnessed the brutal, accelerated transition from these fragile founding narratives to true, centralized states Goguryeo. This transformation was not achieved through diplomacy, but through the crucible of continuous existential war, internal and external. The trial of Goguryeo, the armored thunderbolt. For Goguryeo, the primary threat was not its Korean neighbors, but the massive, ever-shifting tectonic plate of Chinese power. After the collapse of the Han dynasty, China fractured into the 3 kingdoms Wei, Shu, Wu's. Goguryeo, under King Dongchen Dongchunwang, saw an opportunity to solidify its control over the Liaodong region, the crucial gateway to China. This defiance provoked a massive response from the northern Chinese state of Cao Wei. In 245 CE, General Gungujiam Gungugum led a devastating punitive expedition deep into Goguryeo territory. Imagine the sound of 10,000 Wei soldiers marching toward the capital, Hwandosiang. It was the sound of overwhelming, organized imperial force. The Goguryeo army met the invaders, relying on their famed discipline and the fierce loyalty of their tribal factions. But the Wei forces were ruthless. Hwandosiang, a magnificent mountain fortress, fell. King Dongchen was forced to flee, abandoning his court, his treasures, and the physical symbol of his sovereignty. His flight was not just a retreat, it was an act of national humiliation. As he escaped through the deep, frozen valleys, his mind must have been consumed by a single, icy fear: we are too weak, our tribal alliances are insufficient, the Han legacy will consume us all. This crisis, however, forced a radical military innovation that would define Goguryeo for the next 500 years: the Gimamusa Jayema Musa, the iron-armored cavalry. The Gimamusa were not merely horsemen with body armor. They were fully armored human and beast, the horse protected by lacquered leather and iron plating, the rider encased in segment plates that rendered him almost immune to arrows and spears. They were the tanks of the ancient world. The military official, Muru Miru, who orchestrated the king's desperate escape, later led the counterattack. In the frigid forests of the northern border, the Goguryeo forces, strengthened by the new armored units, ambushed the retreating Wei troops. The impact of the Gimamusa was described in near-mythical terms by later historians: a thunderbolt of iron, unstoppable, slicing through the unarmored Chinese infantry. The victory, achieved in 259 CE, was complete and cathartic. Goguryeo had survived. The lesson was etched into the national psyche: survival depends on permanent, centralized military superiority and the absolute subjugation of the enemy. This realization spurred immediate political reform. While Goguryeo still contended with powerful aristocratic clans, kings like Gogukwon recognized the need to break the power of the hereditary Jiga Council. In a daring move, he elevated Ulfaso Ulpaso, a man of humble, possibly commoner origins, to the position of Guksang prime minister. Alfonso's appointment signaled a radical attempt at meritocracy over pure aristocratic lineage. His reforms, including the Jindaebup, a critical state loan system designed to stabilize the peasant class against aristocratic exploitation, were revolutionary steps towards centralized bureaucracy, ensuring that loyalty flowed directly to the throne, not the feudal lords. Baekje's ascent, the architects of statecraft. While Goguryeo was being baptized by fire in the north, Baekje utilized its Han River wealth to achieve institutional maturity at a stunning pace. Baekje's internal transformation was largely due to King Goguryeo, who reigned in the 3rd century. Goi recognized that a king's power lay not in the size of his army alone, but in the efficiency and loyalty of his administration. In a move influenced by the bureaucratic models transmitted through the now-faltering Leleng Commandery, King Goi imposed rigid structure. He formalized the 6 Jwapyong chief ministers system, creating the administrative backbone of the state. He instituted the 16-rank official system, 16 Gwandong, a defined hierarchy that determined status, responsibilities, and, critically, pay. The most visible symbol of this newfound centralized power was the Gwanboje, the standardized color-coded official attire. Only the 6 Jwapyong could wear purple robes, the next ranks wore crimson, and so on. This seemingly minor detail was a profound political statement. Before, tribal leaders wore whatever reflected their local wealth. Now, a man's position was determined by the king, signified by the color of his cloak. Loyalty was codified, visualized, and centralized. This organizational strength allowed Baekje to complete its foundational mission, the annihilation of the Mahan Confederacy. By the mid-4th century, King Junchogo led the final, decisive campaigns that absorbed the remaining Mahan states, including the dominant Mokji-guk. Baekje now controlled the entire southwestern peninsula, its rich agrarian plains secured. Junchogo was not just a conqueror, he was a master diplomat. He sought immediate international recognition, dispatching embassies across the Yellow Sea. In 372 CE, the Chinese Eastern Jin Dongjin dynasty recognized Baekje, bestowing upon Junchogo the title Jindong Janga Nangnang Tisusa, General who Pacifies the East, Governor of Nangnang. This title was a geopolitical trophy. It was a formal Chinese acknowledgement of Baekje's sovereignty and a symbolic dagger twisted into the political corpse of the former Leleng Commandery. Baekje was now firmly established on the international stage. But this ascension brought Junchogo into direct, unavoidable conflict with the resurgent Goguryeo. The Han River Basin, the jewel of the peninsula, was the contested artery of the world they inhabited. The climax of 371 CE. The events leading to the siege of Pyongyang were a culmination of decades of rising tension. Goguryeo had expanded south toward the Dedong River, while Baekje had pushed north to secure the Han River mouth. The two powers were destined to meet in a violent head-on collision. King Gogukwon of Goguryeo, the son of the reforming King Michon, was a capable military leader, but his focus was divided between the southern front and the constant, draining skirmishes with the Chinese state of former Yan in the west. King Junchogo saw his moment. He mobilized the full might of his now centralized, disciplined army. The attack on Pyongyang, Goguryeo's secondary capital at the time, but a symbol of its power, was swift and brutal. Returning to that moment of crisis in 371 CE, King Gogukwon was not simply defeated, he was executed by the Baekje forces. The shockwave of this event rippled across East Asia. Never before had a Korean king, leading a Goguryeo, been slain in battle by a rival Korean state. In Baekje, the victory was intoxicating. Junchogo had achieved total military supremacy over his northern rivals, securing the Han River Basin and validating the effectiveness of his state's centralized reforms. For Goguryeo, the trauma of Gogukwon's death was a baptism of renewed determination. The aristocratic clans, already fractured by the earlier reforms of Alfonso, united under the necessity of vengeance. The succeeding Goguryeo kings, Sajurim and his successors, vowed to turn Baekje's triumph into a bitter, temporary victory. Silla, the rigid caste of the southeast. While the north and west bled, Silla continued its slow, deliberate path of state formation in the shielded southeastern corner. But this isolation came at a cost. Silla's political structure became defined by the most rigid social stratification system in Korean history, the Golpumj or bone rank system. The Golpumj was an ingenious, yet ultimately crippling mechanism designed to manage the assimilation of the various indigenous and absorbed tribal elites, Yukchan. It solidified status based on hereditary lineage. At the apex sat the Seongal Sungol sacred bone, the highest royal line which disappeared shortly after unification. Next came the Jingol true bone, the royal aristocratic clans, the Bak, Siak, and Kim families who controlled the Hwabik Council. Below them were the D-dupum great head ranks, descending from 6 dudupum down to 1 dudupum. The system was absolute. Your gal or pum determined not only the highest official post you could hold, but also the color of your clothing, the size of your house, the type of oxcart you could use, and even the maximum length of your eaves. A brilliant 6 dudupum official, no matter his merit, could never rise above the rank of a Chan Achan or aspire to marry a Jingal. This rigidity provided Silla with phenomenal internal stability during its early, weak phase. It ensured that the newly absorbed elites of conquered regions, like the Gaya territories, knew their place and could never threaten the central authority of the Jingal. However, this structure was a cage. While Goguryeo experimented with meritocracy al faso, Silla locked ambition down. For centuries, the creative intellectual energy of the highly educated Six Dudupum would be frustrated, simmering beneath the surface, a systemic flaw that would eventually plague the unified Silla state. Silla's centralization, therefore, was not marked by swift military conquest, but by the gradual formalization of this aristocratic chokehold, culminating in King Baefyung's Bubhung official adoption of Buddhism in 527 CE, which ironically was implemented to provide a transcendent universal ideology to support this hyper-local rigid caste system. The geopolitical chessboard. By the 5th century, the geopolitical reality of the peninsula had been dramatically altered by the trauma of 371 CE. Goguryeo, fueled by vengeance and a centralized military machine, entered its zenith under King Gyeonggi the Great Gyeonggi and his son, King Jangsu. Gyeonggi consolidated power over Manchuria, earning his posthumous title Broad Expander of Territory, and began a systematic, unrelenting push south. In 475 CE, King Jangsu led a massive invasion force straight to Baekje's capital, Hansung, modern Seoul. But Jangsu had an ace up his sleeve, a dark mirror to the reforms of Baekje's King Goi, espionage. The monk Dalim Dolim was Goguryeo's agent, embedded deep within the Baekje court. Dalim was a master of Go Baduk or Waiki, an intellectual game that fascinated the then-current Baekje king, Goguryeo. Dalim did not bring secrets or maps, he brought distraction. He persuaded King Goguryeo to embark on massive, ostentatious construction projects, new palaces, huge fortifications, complex canals, claiming such monumental works were necessary to reflect the king's celestial authority. King Goguryeo, blinded by vanity and the flattery of the monk he trusted, poured the state's resources into building projects, depleting the national treasury and, more critically, diverting conscripted labor away from military preparedness. When King Jangsu finally launched the attack in 475 CE, Baekje was fiscally bankrupt and militarily exhausted. King Goguryeo, realizing the betrayal, famously climbed his palace ramparts, watching his capital burn. The monk, the stones, the sheer glorious vanity of my kingdom has destroyed us. Hansung fell, King Goguryeo was killed, an echo of the fate his grandfather Junchogo had inflicted on Goguryeo. Baekje was shattered. The entire aristocracy was forced into a desperate, panicked flight south, leaving behind the fertile Han River basin forever, the economic heartland they had spent 4 centuries securing. The capital was relocated to Ungjin, modern Gwangju, a small, defensible mountain town along the Geum River. The powerful, cultured empire of Baekje was reduced to a survivalist state hiding in the hills. Goguryeo now dominated the peninsula, its armies controlling the vast stretch of territory from the Liao River in Manchuria down to the Dedong and Han River basins, an unprecedented hegemony that forced the remaining 2 kingdoms to recalibrate their very existence. The immediate aftermath of the Hansung disaster forced a brutal existential reassessment in the south. Baekje and Silla, 2 states whose relationship had always been cautious and competitive, realized they shared a single, overwhelming enemy, Goguryeo. In 433 CE, long before the final calamity, Baekje and Silla had formed the Naja Dongmeng, the Silla-Baekje alliance to provide mutual protection. Now, after 475 CE, this alliance became the only guarantee of the southern kingdom's survival. Baekje and Ung-jin faced the agonizing task of rebuilding a state from scratch in the shadows of mountains, cut off from its maritime access and its best agricultural land. The Ung-jin period, 475–538 CE, was characterized by a dramatic internal power struggle. The remnants of the old Hanseong aristocracy, the He and Jin clans, clashed fiercely with the revitalized monarchy, desperate to maintain their political influence despite their humiliating defeat. This struggle was resolved through the shrewd statecraft of King Murayong, R 501–523 CE. Murayong centralized authority by expanding the Damro system, 22 regional districts placed under the direct control of the king's own relatives and trusted agents. This bypassed the entrenched old aristocracy, establishing a network of absolute royal loyalty across the shattered kingdom. Murayong's famous tomb, discovered in 1971, stands as a testament to this period of resilience, built not in the traditional heavy stone style of the north, but influenced by the contemporary brick tombs of the southern Chinese dynasties, a clear signal of Baekje's continued diplomatic engagement and cultural refinement, even in retreat. In 538 CE, Baekje officially relocated its capital one last time to Sabi, modern Baekje. The move was tactical and symbolic. Sabi, situated in a wide river plain, was more economically viable than the cramped hills of Ung-jin. Furthermore, King Sungwang formally renamed the state Nambuya, southern Baekje, a deliberate declaration that Baekje, though weakened, still claimed the full political legitimacy and cultural heritage of the northern progenitor Baekje, just as Goguryeo did. Silla, meanwhile, utilized the distraction of its rivals to achieve its own long-delayed institutional revolution. Under King Bubhyung, R 514–540 CE, Silla finally embraced the great continental ideologies that its rivals had adopted centuries earlier. King Byeophyung codified the legal system, Yeolyong, and decisively pushed for the adoption of Buddhism. The adoption of Buddhism was a political tool aimed directly at the Hwabik Council and the traditional aristocracy. To centralize authority, the king needed an ideology that superseded the local tribal gods. Buddhism, with its cosmic order and the king as the Dharma king, a spiritual protector, provided this transcendent mandate. But the old aristocratic forces resisted fiercely. The legendary climax came with the martyrdom of Ikadin I Chadon. Ikadin, a high-ranking court official loyal to the king, volunteered to die for the new faith. He staged a deliberate challenge to the aristocratic council, which immediately ordered his execution. Ikadin's last words, spoken on the execution block, were a terrifying prophecy: "If my sacrifice is true, my body will prove it." When the executioner's sword struck Ikadin's neck, the legend states that instead of blood, a fountain of pure, milky white fluid erupted and the sky darkened dramatically. The aristocrats were terrified, convinced of the divine nature of the new religion. The sight of this white blood broke the religious opposition. Buddhism was officially sanctioned in 527 CE. The king's power was now absolute, backed by codified law and the spiritual authority of the Buddha. With internal consolidation complete, Silla turned its attention to external expansion. Its first target was the Gaya Confederacy. Gaya, the Iron Kingdom, was technologically rich but politically paralyzed by its own fragmentation. Jumguan Gimguan Gaya, the original leader, had been fatally weakened by Goguryeo's incursions a century earlier. When the center of power shifted to Gaya, the Confederacy still failed to unite its dozen city-states under a single crown. In 532 CE, Silla absorbed Jumguan Gaya almost bloodlessly, demonstrating a sophisticated strategy of political integration. Silla offered the defeated Gaya king, Gyuhi, a high position in the Jingal aristocracy, effectively co-opting the defeated elite rather than exterminating them. This strategy culminated in 562 CE under the expansionist King Jinhung. Silla crushed Gaya and formally annexed the entire federation, securing the vital iron resources and agricultural lands of the Nakdong River basin. By the mid-6th century, the geopolitical landscape was utterly transformed. Baekje had rebuilt its state in Sabai strong but permanently displaced from its heartland. Goguryeo was still massive, its power confirmed by its successful defense against nomadic tribes and its control over the northern Han River basin. And Silla, the quiet, persistent survivor, had finally achieved parity, having absorbed the wealth of Gaya and unified its political structure. The Southern Alliance, Naja Dongming, now faced a choice: continue to coexist defensively or turn their combined strength against the north to reclaim Baekje's lost Han River heartland. The choice, driven by desperation and ambition, was made in favor of war. In the 550s CE, Silla and Baekje launched a coordinated attack. Silla under King Jinhyung struck north, while Baekje under King Seong assaulted the key Goguryeo fortresses. The strategy worked brilliantly. The Han River basin was split between the two allies. But alliance in this era was merely a temporary ceasefire. King Jinhyung saw the strategic impossibility of allowing Baekje to fully regain its former strength in the heartland. In a stunning act of betrayal, Silla immediately seized the entire Han River basin from its ally. King Seong of Baekje was enraged by the perfidy. For a king who had rebuilt his nation from the ashes of Hanseong and risked his state's stability to reclaim its ancestral territory, Silla's betrayal was an unforgivable insult, striking at the very core of his political legitimacy. He gathered his forces and launched a desperate retaliatory strike against Silla. In 554 CE, near the fortress of Gwansanseong Gwansansung, King Seong was ambushed, captured, and summarily executed by Silla forces. The murder of King Seong ended the Naja alliance, replacing it with an enduring, poisoned rivalry between Silla and Baekje. Silla, now controlling the Han River, had secured the gateway to the Yellow Sea and, crucially, direct maritime access to China. The map of the peninsula was fixed. Goguryeo controlled the north, Baekje controlled the southwest, and Silla, the ultimate opportunist, controlled the entire southeast and the vital central artery. The stage was now set for the final, devastating act of unification. The centuries of warfare, political maneuvering, and radical institutional reform did not end with the death of King Seong in 554 CE. That event merely solidified the dynamic that would define the next century: Silla's alliance with the colossal emerging power of Tang China against the combined, desperate resistance of Baekje and Goguryeo. But the true legacy of the Three Kingdoms formation does not lie in the final unification of 668 CE. It lies in the foundational structures, the bones and sinew, that were forged during those chaotic early centuries. The collapse of Go-Josun forced the Korean people, scattered across tribal confederacies, to build states from scratch under immense external pressure. The resulting polities, Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla, were not copies of the Han Empire, but unique, hardened entities that synthesized foreign models with indigenous necessity. First, the institutional revolution. The move from decentralized tribal power to centralized bureaucracy, marked by the adoption of Yeolyong legal codes and Gwandung rank systems, was essential for survival. These systems, designed to manage large populations and fund professional armies, became the permanent administrative blueprint for the unified Silla, Goguryeo, and Joseon dynasties. Even today, the Korean societal emphasis on hierarchy, rank, and systematic organization has deep historical roots in the statecraft established by figures like Baekje's King Goi. Second, the ideological consolidation. The strategic embrace of Buddhism was perhaps the most crucial political decision of the era. It provided the king with a divine, universal mandate, transcending the local loyalties of the Jiga Council or the Hwabik aristocracy. The king became the pivot point of both spiritual and temporal power, a fundamental concept that ensured political stability amidst relentless conflict. Third, the legacy of identity. The diverse paths taken by the three states created an enduring, complex national memory. Goguryeo's Goguryeo legacy is that of the uncompromising martial spirit, the defiant bulwark against overwhelming continental power. The vision of the Gimamusa, the armored thunderbolt, remains a powerful symbol of Korean resilience and military prowess. Baekje's Baekje legacy is that of cultural refinement, diplomacy, and enduring heritage. Despite being twice defeated and twice forced to relocate its capital, its artistic genius and its role as a cultural bridge to the Japanese archipelago left an indelible mark on East Asian civilization. The exquisite grace of Baekje gold and sculpture speaks to a people who understood that power could be expressed through beauty as much as through the sword. Silla's Silla legacy is the triumph of patience and political strategy. Its history reminds us that enduring strength is not always found in initial conquest, but in strategic waiting, internal discipline, however rigid like the Galpumj, and the ability to choose the right allies at the critical geopolitical moment. The story of the Three Kingdoms formation is fundamentally the story of Han. Han is a complex Korean concept that defies simple translation, encompassing a deep sense of national grievance, unresolved historical pain, and profound, internalized resilience. The Han of this era was the unresolved pain of the original fragmentation, the betrayal felt by King Seong on the plains of Gwansinseong, the shame of King Gero tricked by a monk. It was the perpetual tension of a proud people, constantly forced to fight for their small piece of earth against the weight of a continent. But this Han also fueled the fierce tenacity, the profound cultural achievements, and the political acumen that allowed the Korean people to transcend the collapse of Go-Josun, repel the Chinese empires, and ultimately forge a singular nation that has persevered through millennia of turbulence. The echoes of that fragmented beginning, the constant struggle for the strategic heartland, the delicate balance between external powers, and the perpetual internal conflict between merit and rigid lineage, are not merely relics of antiquity. They are the living DNA of the Korean political experience, forever rooted in the bloody, brilliant birth of the Three Kingdoms.